Okay, next we'll be hearing from Dr. Lisa Shulman. She's professor of pediatrics here and director of Einstein's Infant Toddler Services at RFK SERS, and also, importantly, the ACT Early Ambassador to New York State.
It's really an honor to be here. And I too have to start off with my remembrance of Dr. Rapin. Let's fast forward 15 years from where Ted left off. I'm a relatively new attending, and Isabel Rapin includes me in a meeting to discuss a new research endeavor. The neurology department has a strong interest in seizures, and with the advent of the camcorder, video camera, now that group of parents who have been reporting that their young children with autism had been talking and then seemed to have lost that ability or regressed, the neurologists, headed by Isabel, wanted to look and see if that group of children with EEG study were along the continuum of Landau-Kleffner, a known neurologic condition, epileptic aphasia, that led to regression of language generally later. And so we ran an early intervention program. I was its director. She included me in the meeting. So I walk into the room. I also happen to be 9 months pregnant. And I look around the room, and formidable is the word. Not only is Isabel there, but other legends in the field surround me. And we start off talking about, first, the definition of regression, loss of 6 words. They move on to other topics. And my heart starts beating really fast because I'm the director of early intervention. We've seen 200 kids with, at that point, with identification of autism early. And we're finding about 20 to 25% of the parents are reporting regression, but never of 6 words. This was happening gradually, before the kids really had a consistent vocabulary, and it was kind of like maybe a word or two, and they weren't pointing or weren't playing peekaboo or weren't waving bye-bye. And I remember with trepidation kind of like raising my hand and saying, can we get back to that, 6-word definition? I'm thinking back to all the kids I've seen over the past couple of years, and I'm afraid none of them would qualify for inclusion in the study. And I go on to say just what I said, that I think we need to include the loss of social communicative acts. And I'm like dying. And I can't even read the facial expressions around me. Isabel had this way of looking at you, as was said, where you're just not sure whether she is about to cut you down or praise you. And anyway, so she said, "Bravo, you finally decided to speak up." We included you at the table because we don't see these kids for another 2 or 3 years, and we know you do. So what you have to say is the most important piece of information on this topic. And by saying that, she really invited me to the table. And in the spirit, you can't get a better example of the spirit of today's conference. Autism, of all topics, needs to involve clinicians and that full spectrum, we're going to be using that word a lot today, all the way to pure researchers and everything in between. And it's a lesson that I heed often when I think, what do I have to contribute to the discussion on a given research topic? So thank you, Isabel, and thank you for allowing me to share that story. Okay, this is going to be quick, but I figured we should start off making sure that we have the vocabulary to have discussions together. What is autism in 2018? The early identification of autism, and then hopefully there'll be time to talk a little bit about our Bronx clinical frontline. Okay, let me give a couple of examples, or 3 to be exact. Jonathan is a 21-month-old toddler, and he's not yet speaking. His mother's been concerned that maybe he has a hearing problem because he doesn't respond when she calls his name, but a hearing test was normal. Father is not concerned. He says that Jonathan is not even 2. What do we expect? Boys talk later. But mom is worried and thinks he might need speech therapy. You observe Jonathan to be a very serious toddler. You cannot get him to smile. He doesn't respond to any of your bag of tricks. He doesn't respond when called by name. He isn't interested in any of the many toys in the office. When you sing Wheels on the Bus, you don't even get his attention. While you're speaking to his mother, Jonathan spends his time opening and closing the door of the office for about 20 minutes. Michael could not be more different. He was born talking according to his mom with full sentences by 18 months. The parents have had no concern whatsoever about his development. At age 3, Michael entered a nursery program, and at the first parent-teacher conference, the parents heard in shock that the teacher was concerned about Michael's social skills. He doesn't talk or play with the other children. In fact, the teacher realized recently that he still doesn't know the names of his classmates. He'll refer to them as boy, girl. No matter what the class is talking about, Michael steers the topic to things of interest to him, about which he is a tremendous expert. Thomas the Tank Engine and the New York City subway system. You want to go from point A to point B, he's your man. A loud sound, such as a fire drill or another child crying, causes him to cover his ears and try to leave the room. And lastly, here's Henry. Henry's 5.5 years old, and the reason why early September is a very busy month at the Children's Evaluation and Rehabilitation Center. His mother dropped him off today for his first day of school ever, first day of kindergarten, and she has her fingers crossed. This is his first school experience. Until now, he's been home with his grandmother. He was born 4 weeks early, but's been a healthy boy. His language has been slow to develop, so his mother hadn't felt he was ready for school until now. So she dropped him off, crossed her fingers, just got home, and the school just called and said, please come and pick him up. He's been under the table in the kindergarten class for the past 2 hours, reciting something. It sounds like scenes from his favorite movie, Cars, and it's clear that he would benefit from a smaller setting and will need an evaluation. So, like, spoiler alert, those are 3 kids with autism who presented at different times with different clinical presentations. They all need to fall under this category of what is autism in 2018. All right, we are using DSM-5 for 5 years now, so just to, again, use the same nomenclature here. Remember those autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, PDD, NOS? They're all now called autism spectrum disorder. It was going from a broad definition of pervasive developmental disorders in DSM-4 to a narrower one. There are only 12 combinations of criteria to arrive at a diagnosis compared to the 2,688 combinations in DSM-4, the looser construct. And in brief, here are the ASD criteria from DSM-5. There are 3 required deficits in social communication and interaction. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity. The give and take when you smile at a baby and they smile back. When you are an older child and you engage emotionally as well as usually visually. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior. Even if you have no language, people will use their eye contact, their pointing, their gestures, general vocalizations, whatever, to communicate with someone else. And deficits in developing and maintaining relationships. And then the definition requires 2 out of the 4 following restricted repetitive behaviors interests: repetitive speech and movements, which were felt to be along the same continuum, excessive rigidity or adherence to routines, fixated interests, and I decided to put in special coloring, for the first time ever, hyporeactivity to sensory input, a topic of tremendous interest to a lot of people in the room. It's always been a part of parental and firsthand descriptions of autism, but the first time it ever got included in the criteria. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on early diagnosis of ASD. How early? What does it look like? To talk about how early, I have a video that is among my prized possessions, like on VCR. It's of Barry Brazelton, who also died in the past year, the grandfather of pediatrics, with a baby who was just born on the warmer in the newborn nursery. And he's standing on one side of the baby, like saying, "Baby, if you can hear me, look at me." And this brand newborn, like still wet, naked, it like turns his head and looks at him. And just to show that this isn't just a fluke, he goes to the other side. "Baby, if you can hear me, look at me." And you see this newborn baby programmed to respond to language in a way that is indisputable. Okay, that's a newborn. This is my absolute favorite study. I didn't do it, but I love it. Okay, in the 90s, again, these giant camcorders in every household. If you had a baby celebrating a first birthday, you can bet there's a video of that first birthday celebration. And so Osterling went on the new internet and said, would people be willing to share with me the first birthday videotapes of their children who were later diagnosed with autism, as well as a control group? And I want to see if there's a way to distinguish between those two groups at 12 months. And there was. 90% of the children subsequently diagnosed with autism could be picked out from blinded evaluators. These were the signs predictive of autism at 12 months. Lack of eye contact, failure to orient to name, no pointing to request, and no showing behavior to indicate interest in something and sharing that interest with somebody that's important in their life. The showing behavior is actually the most sensitive of the behaviors. And of course, I'll point out, these are all no, not. These are what we refer to as the negative signs of autism, the absence of social communicative actions and attention, rather than the positive signs of autism that most of us associate with autism, the hand flapping, the toe walking, the spinning in circles. Okay, so we have that example from birth and 12 months. In reality, in clinical practice, how do we make a valid early diagnosis? The key to the whole process is understanding the difference between delayed development versus atypical development. Developmental delay. A 6-year-old is demonstrating good skills for a 3-year-old. Good skills, in social communication and everything else. Versus atypical development in the social and communication direction. That child is demonstrating a pattern of skill acquisition or a set of skills that are not characteristic of any age. They have come off the page of the developmental milestone chart, and you're looking at this and saying, this is not the way it's supposed to go. What does that look like in each of these domains that are the definition of autism? Let's think through things in a spectrum. Social impairment. Okay, there are the kids who have completely absent social interest or motivation. I know them, you know them. They walk into the room and it is as if you are not present. Then there are the kids who have diminished social interest or motivation. They come in, they do not look at me, they approach whatever's in my room back to me. They would happily play, and their parents will often report they'll play alone at home for 5-6 hours. But if I pull out something of true interest, bubbles for very little kids or music, I can get their attention with that. And then there are the kids, I'll say like Michael in the case examples, who may have a social interest, may want to interact with the other kids, but seem to be missing the social skills rulebook. They weren't born with it, and they don't know how to interact with other kids, may hit another child to get something going. What does this look like in the youngest children? Again, talking to a 2-month-old and getting into a reciprocal kind of pattern of mutual gaze and vocalization. Sharing affect. You smile at a baby, they smile back. When you see older children who you can't get that pattern with, we're talking about 9-month-olds, 14-month-olds, it just hits you over the head. They have an absence of shared affect. Joint attention is the 3 points. A stranger appears at the door. The baby is sitting next to the mother. To make sense of this person the baby has never seen before, the baby will look at mother. Is mother happy? Is mother frightened? Look back and draw mother's attention to the stranger. and help figure out what her reaction should be. It's a 3-point sharing of eye contact. These things, when they are absent, because they're expected so young, are glaring. Thinking through communication. Again, there are the children with a complete lack of language who grow into 20% of the time adults with a complete or near complete lack of language in autism. There are the individuals with atypical language whose basically vocalizations are repeating scenes from favorite movies. There are the children like Michael who have a lot of language, perhaps a fantastic vocabulary, but are unable to understand the give and take of a conversation or have pragmatic language difficulties. What does this look like in very, very young children? First and foremost, you have to say lack of attention to language as measured by lack of response to name. Okay, the newborn on the warmer responds to language by looking at Barry Brazelton. The 4-month-old on all the developmental screeners is supposed to respond to language. The 6-month-old reliably respond when called. When I can't get a child's attention by calling their name and confirm that that is indeed what the parent calls them, I could call their name 100 times and not get any response. It is glaring. And when the parent confirms, like, how do you get your child's attention? Oh, he doesn't respond when I call him. I have to go get him. You know his hearing is normal? There are very few things that cause that other than autism. Then there's just how powerful eye contact and gestures are that are evident so early in typical development. I always use the example of you're in line at the supermarket. A mother with a baby in the cart is in front of you. The mother's unpacking the cart. The baby drops her pacifier on the floor. She makes general sounds, catches your eye, looks at you, looks at the pacifier, looks back at you, and it is as if she has announced, please get me my pacifier that I dropped on the floor. It's that clear. And of course, you know it when you see it. So when that's missing, even when a child has language, I always joke and advise, put a toy high up in the room that child is going to want and see how they try to get it. I have kids who have language. They may try and scale the wall to try to get something they can't possibly get. They may stand underneath the toy and say, without looking at me, getting my attention, directing my attention in any way, pirate ship, pirate ship, pirate ship, pirate ship. But they're not using their language to communicate that they want it. Meanwhile, the baby brother in the stroller is like, look at that thing, that's what I want, without a word, and communicating so clearly. And again, it becomes glaring when you see the absence of that communicative intent. And then atypical interests. There are kids that if anybody's ever seen a child with autism, they can identify because that child does the very unusual things of autism. They're spinning, they're flapping, they're flicking things before their eyes, they're squinting at things, looking out of the corners of their eyes. They're the kids who come to the clinic and say, yeah, the lady on the bus said I should come to the Kennedy Center because her son has this same sort of thing and they can help me here. Then there are kids, little kids fall into this category much more often, like the first boy, Jonathan. They're not doing things that hit you over the head in terms of being unusual, but they are so repetitive with normal things. This boy spent 20 minutes opening and closing the door. Okay, toddlers like to open and close doors. But what if you heard that he spent 2 hours doing it a day? What if you heard the family had to take all the doors off all the rooms in their home because he could spend all day doing it? You really start to cross a line and say, this normal interest is abnormal in its degree of perseveration. Okay, and milder social deficits like the child Michael often do come to light more in an organized first peer exposure when it's clear the child is not interacting appropriately with peers. So laying out our spectrum of impairment, social impairment can go from a complete lack of social interest to lack of social know-how, communication, no language, highly atypical language, pragmatic difficulties, atypical interests that are obviously atypical or perseverative to the point of being atypical. And then I'm going to put cognition up there, very delayed. A child with splinter skills who can read at 2 but not understand what he or she is reading, to actually gifted. And the main point I want to make is these things operate separately, separate continua. You can have severe social impairment. Be an extremely autistic child like the one I had in my office yesterday, whose mother told me she's homeschooling him because he's on a 3rd grade level, even though he's 5 years old, because he has splinter skills, and to be honest, his psychological testing is in the normal range. He is severely autistic and he has normal cognition. Then you can have the child who's severely cognitively impaired. All of their skills are very delayed, and yeah, maybe they have mild autism. And you can have everything in between. Which leads to some of the things we're going to be talking about today. What is low-functioning autism? When I hear parents come in and say, my child, like the one yesterday, who's reading on the 3rd grade level and doing math on a 3rd grade level, well, I know he's very high-functioning. Well, he's high-functioning in terms of learning and cognition, but he is so autistic. Is he high-functioning? Absolutely not. So what is low-functioning autism? You have a significant co-occurring intellectual disability. You have a severe social impairment, like this boy I'm telling you who was so smart. Children who only have both. We have to define our terms when we're talking about any study of anyone. Okay, I know I have like now 30 seconds left. So just to say, the signs of autism are evident by 2 years of age. When children don't get diagnosed until kindergarten, like Henry, case 3, we're kind of sitting there saying, what has gone on? How did this happen? And African American children and Hispanic children are less likely than Caucasian children to be identified before school age, even though we know early intervention is so beneficial. And there are a lot of information about the types of barriers families confront that can get in the way of an early diagnosis. But what can we learn from the clinical front? I like what Ted drew our attention to. The majority of us here have a connection with the Bronx. Am I right? Raise your hand if you have a connection with the Bronx. Okay, let's remind ourselves. It's the poorest, most diverse, youngest urban population in the United States. I love this quote from the census. The U.S. Census considers the Bronx to be the most diverse area in the country. There is an 89.7% chance that any 2 residents chosen at random would be of different race or ethnicity. The Kennedy Center, Children's Evaluation and Rehabilitation Center, is plopped down, sitting in the heart of the Bronx. We follow 1 million children. 1,600 of those children have autism. We diagnose about 300 new children with autism, the majority under 6 years of age. And what demographic do they come from? The Bronx. I realized how special this was and recalled Isabel's bravo to me in 2008 when we went to the International Meeting for Autism Research with one of our first posters, Clinical Characterization of Children Diagnosed with Autism by 24 Months. We had a sample of 108 children, 43% Hispanic, 24% African American, the majority with Medicaid. Even though it was a really kind of breaking news about what autism looked like in 24 kids who were younger than 24 months, the only questions I really was asked were, oh my gosh, how did you get this group of Hispanic and African American children diagnosed so early? Don't you know that they're late to be diagnosed? And then we would go to meetings in the years since then, and I would say, this is the comment that is made most often to me. So I alert to that and say, what is it that allows us to make diagnoses in this age group? Well, of course, we're functioning in the Bronx. This is our population. But I did want to bring out the point, and it was evident in the first case. The young children we diagnosed, they weren't referred by the model that most people have in mind of, oh, the parent has a concern, maybe of autism or of anything. The pediatrician at 18 months does a screening instrument, and the child failed. The child is referred to the developmental pediatrician or early intervention with, this child may have autism. Please evaluate this child. And then services implemented for autism. That's what I call kind of the linear model. No, that doesn't apply here. Instead, the children come for some other reason. Are they language delayed? Do they have emotional problems? Does he have anger issues? He walks on his tiptoes. He eats 2 foods. And my usual comment is, because we at the Rose F. Kennedy Children's Evaluation and Rehabilitation Center bring our autism expertise to the front door, they get an early autism diagnosis whether they asked for it or not. And so, yeah, we can diagnose children with autism early in the Bronx due to being situated in the heart of the Bronx and being an accepted and trusted resource. Barriers to diagnosis have been reduced. Parents can refer themselves. All insurance is accepted. And we don't stand on ceremony and have an autism unit that children can be seen in after somebody has voiced concern of autism. So in Isabel's memory, I'm going to echo Sophie's words. You know, it takes, the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. We all know it takes a major metropolitan area, a universe, to identify, treat, and raise a child with autism to reach his or her potential. And it takes clinicians and researchers working together to take the small steps that turn into the leaps forward. Thank you. Anybody have one question? Are there differences between boys and girls? Not in the very young kids, although that is something we've pulled together regarding a wider swath of children and ages, and we will probably be presenting at the upcoming, if it gets accepted, Pediatric Academic Society's meeting. There are some differences, but often, again, that message Isabel taught of like, what are you an expert in? I often read things, and when they don't strike me as in line with my clinical experience, I alert to it. So the idea that girls may not be picked up because they're more urged to be social. There's a bunch of reasons why it's thought that girls may be kind of taught and not picked up because their symptoms may be more subtle or they are taught to fit in better. And I don't know that we think that's so. First of all, we have many, I didn't say this, but 60% of children nationally with autism have a co-occurring intellectual disability. In our sample, it's usually 70 or 75%. We have a lot of low-functioning girls. So I find it difficult to kind of buy into that exact description. And in fact, because girls are expected to be so social, and their peers are so social, and there's no, there's no sports to serve as a kind of common medium. Girls end up often being identified as being socially odd with milder symptoms than boys. Anyway, it's not as clear-cut as it's often described in the literature.
Lisa, I think this depends on where a child is on the spectrum and your treating member of the family. How much progress can you make, generally speaking, with early signs of detection? I know it would depend on where you are on the spectrum, but are you seeing good progress in trying to describe that?
You mean
as
outcomes?
a general question.
Yeah. So there are a group of children who, when we see them, are clearly autistic, and we can't even get their attention. They're untestable on psychological. They're just they fall into that category of they have no social interest, or more commonly, diminished social interest. And that when I usually visually picture ABA, early intensive behavioral intervention of autism, like a lasso that grabs that child and says, we are sitting down here now, and for those of you who remember Doris Allen, even though it wasn't called ABA, what she did was like ABA, and insist, you're sitting here now, and when I speak to you, you're gonna look up at me, and we're gonna reward you. And, when I do something, you're gonna imitate me. And get into that reciprocal attention to language, conversation, by kind of hook or crook, and reinforce it. Like we know, operant conditioning can increase the likelihood of any behavior. There are a group of kids who kind of click in and basically say, okay, and who we see. The next time we see them, wow, their improvement is more than we would have expected. Now, I'm not gonna say that that's large numbers, but when you have those kids, and we have 38 of them that we report on and publish on in a follow-up study, you're struck because we have the early documentation. This was a flapper and a spinner and unrelated. And now this child speaks, and now this child has academic skills, and now this child got to the point where they learn casually. And so there are these strategies. Do they work for everyone? No. There are some individuals who are so autistic, and we're talking here, they're on that spectrum of social impairment, they are so severe that it is very difficult to impact on. And then there are the ones who have such profound intellectual disability that their gains are very, very limited. But there are fewer behavior problems in children and families who have gone through these sorts of interventions. And it's often the behavior problems later on that end up excluding children and adults from work opportunities, group homes, and just make life very, very difficult. And there are strategies for that.